poetry vlog and another segment of Patrick and Pop Culture. And we are in Chicago because we're here for a conference, Modern Language Association, or MLA, and we're filming in our Airbnb. So you can check out the Instagram if you want to see the story of how we set up this episode. And remember to comment and below to let us know how this content works for you. Patrick, why are we here and why are we drinking tea?
Okay. So like Chelsea said, we're here in Chicago for a conference, but we're also here to commemorate the place where disco died. On July 12th, 1979, in Kaminsky Park, right over there, there was this thing called Disco Demolition Night, and a local radio station had people in the city bring disco records, and they blew them up in the middle of this baseball field, and it was this big event, the Disco Demolition Night, and it actually caused so much damage that the Chicago team had to end up forfeiting. The White Sox ended up forfeiting the game because Disco Demolition Night turned into this super violent, almost riot. It got really, really intense. And so they had to call the game off, they had to forfeit it, because what began as this cute, sort of cool radio station gimmick turned into this really scary moment where disco died. So we're here in Chicago to commemorate disco. We're also drinking tea because we are talking about DA Powell and his work, his sort of modern day divine comedy, this collection of 3 books, Tea, Lunch, and Cocktails. These were recently collected in a book of his called Repast.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah. So these were his first 3 books, Tea in 98, Lunch in 2000, and Cocktails in 2004. So we're taking it back. We're taking it back to disco. We're taking it back to the early 2000s. We're talking about disco music. We're talking about DA Powell, and we're talking about how sort of dance music plays into Powell's poetry, and then also how it plays into sort of HIV/AIDS and queerness.
Okay.
So what do you know about DA Powell?
My introduction to DA Powell was the book Chronic.
Okay.
And he was coming to town to do a poetry reading, and I knew that he was explicitly writing through AIDS as a poet who had really lived through the extraordinary genocidal early AIDS crisis itself, and was a pretty active activist, to be redundant, about both the relationship between ecological crises and chronic illnesses and their infectious diseases and things like that. Yeah. And it was the first poet where, for me, because I had just learned that HIV and Lyme are cousins, the spirochetal microbes they operate in the same way as a corkscrew kind of autoimmune function, that I came, and nobody had written poetry from Lyme perspectives, where I felt like my queerness and my Lyme were now a conversation with another element of being queer. And of writing through illness without it being about me or about Lyme disease per se, which for me is more freeing. So I was really excited by that, and Chronic was a really important book for me.
I had a really similar experience with D.A. Powell. It came before Chronic with Cocktails, because D.A. Powell is a gay man living with HIV, and Tea, Lunch, and Cocktails is really about writing through that. Well, and I think what's so exciting for me about Powell's poetry is how fun it is.
Exactly.
Tom Gunn, wonderful poetry, not fun poetry. But Powell, it's hilarious, it's full of puns, it's campy, it's silly, it's wonderful.
And real quick for our listeners, what's campy mean?
That, we're going to talk about that.
Okay,
we're going to talk about
so if you were put a pin in that, what did campy mean? That's coming.
Because camp is a huge part of what makes his poetry, what makes Powell have that D.A. Powell sound. It's a big part of disco. It's a big part of gay nightlife. Yes, exactly. It's a huge part of queerness, and it's a huge part of sort of surviving AIDS. So Powell is this important poet within the history of like AIDS poetry, after Tom Gunn, but before people like Jericho Brown and Denez Smith.
Yeah.
So coming at this very significant juncture. Also, it's important to know that combination therapy became accessible in 1994. It was by no means a sort of reliable treatment for HIV, but it did sort of prolong some life. It was no longer the death sentence that it was when AIDS first came on the scene in the 1980s, but it was still, combination therapy and AZT were not totally reliable. It came later on. More recently, we have things like Atripla, Stribild, Truvada, which people take as PrEP now, so now it's a prophylactic against HIV. So Powell is coming post-epidemic, but pre-reliable forms of treatment. And that's another important thing to keep in mind with like the juncture of where these poems are coming.
Yeah.
So a little bit about Powell's sort of style. He quite famously took his notebook and turned it on its side, because he found that he was writing these long lines with these great big pauses. At the end of these clauses, usually at a period, he will hit the space bar 3 times. So there's almost this gasp, this sort of breathlessness. The introduction to Repast calls it heavy breathing, which I think is fantastic, because you think of like, you're on the dance floor, you're in the middle of having sex, like it's that heavy breathing. And that really embodied quality is a huge part of Powell's work. Mm-hmm. So the poems, they look unlike other poems. They have a very experimental look to them, but there is a kind of readability to them. I think it was Stephen Burt said something like, no accessible poet is so original, and no original poet is so accessible. And that's the DA Powell catchphrase, right? So let's talk tea.
Okay, but real quick, I want to also add for our student listeners, that's a really great reading exercise. So if you're someone who struggles with line breaks, try that. Take your notebook, turn it around, and then write from that space, and then see where you can create line breaks within the lines or where you need them, and read them out loud and play with the breath on the page without letting the usual vertical structure force you to break lines.
Yep.
Yeah.
Perfect. So one thing that Powell is really going for, and one thing that I think has really entered the current lexicon thanks to RuPaul's Drag Race, is like, what's the tea?
Oh yeah,
spill the tea. So easy enough. Gay people, gay men especially, referred to as queens, sitting down and having tea like royalty it follows naturally.
Yeah, right? It's like gossip. It's like it's like the queer version of like old ladies on a porch drinking iced tea.
Yep.
But it's like,
yeah. So you had the night before, you went out dancing, and then the next morning you sit down for tea and you spill the tea and you talk about what happened, who is sleeping with who said what to whom, like you spill that tea.
You throw like mild shade. Mild being the key word. It's like the art of it. Yeah.
So, and this is another very D.A. Powell kind of move, is the word that means one thing, sitting down for tea, and it also means another thing, gossip.
Yeah.
And queerness, and sort of community between gay men.
Yeah.
And there's also a sort of coyness and silliness to these things, but a silliness that is deadly serious. So Tea opens with a series of elegies, a series of poems for men that died of AIDS. Like I said, this was published in 1998, so this is coming right on the tails of AIDS as an epidemic. And the name of the section for this first section with all the elegies is Tea Leaves. It verges on irreverence, like this pun of leaves, to be writing a bunch of elegies, and it's like, they're leaving, the tea leaves. Like, it refuses to commemorate these men with just like deadly seriousness. It refuses that. Of course it's serious, of course it is. But it's also not serious at all. It's also just very, very silly.
Yeah.
And there's another section in the book called Tea Dance. And Tea Dance was the, when all the gay men would get together on Sundays, this was like the last time going out of the weekend, you can really spill the tea and talk about what has happened since Friday. You have your tea dance. And at the first page of the tea dance section in Tea, Powell gives us a list of songs. 11 disco songs that equate sex and death through an elaborate metaphor called heaven. And we get a series of disco songs. Things like Paradise by the group called Change, Take Me to Heaven by Sylvester, Earth Can Be Just Like Heaven, which he says here is by the Weather Girls, but it's actually once they started performing under the name 2 Tons of Fun. Heaven's Where My Heart Is by Marsha Raven. So he's looking at all these songs that are very cheesy and very silly and saying, no, this is a site where pleasure and death meet.
Yeah.
So here's a poem from that section. It's called He Must Have Been a DJ, this one. The pulse quickens at another lost companion sale. Another DA Powell maneuver is to make the title the first line of the poem, but just put it in brackets. So here's the poem. He must have been a DJ, this one. The pulse quickens at another lost companion sale. I filter and dilber through crates of vinyl, the glowing end of my glee cuffed in reverence. Lovers carted away in stacks. No needle to test them, but I'm willing to take a chance, and the price is small. Any noise might easily be reduced, a matter of fading. The way the past is actively recaptured, not a whiff of poppers and Halston Z14, no brief encounter with a surviving negative, just a soundtrack undergoing reconstruction. He's a saint. He's a sinner. The mix as a product of survival, pushing up to 144 BPM. All right, so Chelsea, was that your first time hearing this poem?
It was my first time hearing
Your
it.
first time? Okay,
Yeah.
so what were some of your reactions to it?
For me, I was like finding it ironic. It was a poem about the sound receding and then being moved into by these other disco pieces potentially.
Nice.
Right? So I was like, okay, these other sounds die with the people, but then there's also this like way of reconstructing and like crossing that line into like stretched out kinship and temporality. Right? Through the reading out loud of the poem and the construction of this music coming back. But I don't want to take up too much space. So
Cool. No, I love what you said about the extension of kinship, because that's so important to what's going on here. Like, what's going on in this poem, first off, like, you might not feel totally initiated into this poem. There's some lingo happening here that you might not totally understand. So the pulse quickens at another lost companion sale. So what we're dealing with here, we can assume that someone's lover has died of AIDS, and the sort of everything that this companion has left behind is now being sold. It's sort of like an estate sale. And the speaker of the poem is rummaging through the deceased's record collection. And he's looking at all these different disco albums. We can assume, given the list of disco songs that we saw at the beginning, equating sex and death, we have someone who has gone to heaven, and the speaker is looking at all the records that have been left behind. So the connection with this person, the kinship with this person, even though he has died, is extended and even deepened. And that really comes to the fore when you get to the lines, lovers carted away in stacks, no needle to test them, but I'm willing to take a chance. So the record itself becomes synonymous with the lover, and there's no needle to test them. So that's the needle to sort of run the blood test to see if they've tested positive for HIV, but then it's also the needle to test the record, to see if it's scratched, to see if it's still high fidelity. The price is small. Any noise might easily be reduced, a matter of fading. So this listening to disco music, which is unabashedly cheesy and unabashedly gay, is a way of commemorating those that we've lost.
Right.
And we really get that in the line, "The glowing end of my glee, cuffed in reverence." So disco, one of the songs that's listed in the 11 disco songs that equate sex with death is "Heaven Must Have Sent You" by Bonnie Pointer. "Heaven Must Have Sent You" by Bonnie Pointer, which is this like gloriously cheesy song. It's so good. Like that, link to that on this. That's wonderful. And it's a very campy song.
Yeah.
And like that's a really important sensibility. And I use the word sensibility intentionally. So when I say camp, maybe don't worry about defining it, but when I say camp, like what comes to mind?
Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Perfect.
Right.
Perfect. Anything else?
Oh gosh, too many things. We're gonna move on.
Okay.
Because gay nightlife culture, excess. When people say queer excess, they're usually referring to that sort of like self-ironic, like overplaying dramatization of like the drag show. So camp really came into the lexicon sort of like in the late 19th, early 20th century with someone like Oscar Wilde. And camp is obsessed with surface, obsessed with artifice, and obsessed with taste. Yeah. Taste that is Baroque, Rococo, shiny, glittery, and a little bit tacky. Too much.
Camp
is all about the too much in a way that makes you feel like there's something kind of eerie going on, but in like not a horror. Like the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Yeah. There's a cheese factor to it. There's a tackiness to it. But
like
there's
skating in the 80s.
Yeah, but there's also like a love of it. So there is a sincere love for Tiffany lamps, for Strauss operas, for disco. Susan Sontag wrote an essay called Notes on Camp, and this is a really important essay in defining it as a sensibility, because camp is less about how something looks and what something is, and more like our attachments to it.
Yeah, it's a method.
It is a method. Yeah, absolutely. And she wrote that essay in 1964. And it's an important essay, but it's also important to note that 1964 is pre-Stonewall and certainly pre-AIDS and way pre-DA Powell. So it's sort of camp before camp became like a very queer sensibility. But what's important is there's one line that she has in this essay that I think is really important to put some pressure on. Quote, "To patronize the faculty of taste is to patronize oneself. For taste governs every free, as opposed to rote, human response. Nothing is more decisive." End quote. And I love that because it totally gets to the point that having a sensibility for disco, as cheesy as it is an assertion of one's own autonomy. And to do it in the face of something like what happened at Kaminsky Park, where these disco records were blown up and burned to the ground, and to still assert oneself and to say, I know it's tacky, but I love it.
Yeah.
That is a radically political act.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting is that Sontag makes the case that like camp is apolitical because it is so surface, but like that's
the opposite.
Certainly like post Stonewall, not at all, Susan.
Yeah.
So like it's an important essay, but it's a dated essay.
Well, because camp is like a way of perceiving, right? That's like inherently political. Like how we perceive like the things that we decide are desirable or are good or are worth like time to spend with. Like that is a very political act in and of itself.
Right.
And I remember Susan Sontag's essay was my introduction in undergrad to the concept of camp as camp. I remember being relieved because it seemed like it was like my baby step introduction to postmodernism, right?
Yeah, right.
Because it was like, oh, this is a style that is hyper aware that taste is a choice, but it's accumulation of choices within a set community, and it has to be irreverent then, because taste is no longer in that moment this like thing that's decided by this one group, and then it's uniformly placed on everyone else. There's a certain freedom for play that comes out immediately when you realize that taste is just a set of choices made within a discourse community.
Yeah.
A community talking to each other is discourse community.
And when that taste is in some way bad taste, it is in bad taste. It is even more.
It's a giant middle finger.
Yeah, it's assertive to say like, I have bad taste. We all have bad taste.
Yeah.
But you know what? The glowing end of my glee is cuffed in reverence. So my bad taste is radical. It's important. It keeps me connected to those that have passed on. Mm-hmm. And it really helps assert me and my kin in the face of an epidemic.
Yeah.
And that's why disco, that's why camp is so important to Powell, to gay men, to surviving AIDS.
To tea.
Absolutely. So I want to turn now to the last poem in the last book of his trilogy.
Okay.
Because I feel like this is the perfect farewell to what Powell is getting at in this book. We're going to wrap up. So this is the last poem. And let me just say that the reason Cocktails has become so important to me is when I got my own diagnosis as being HIV positive, I was, as anyone would be, lost, confused, scared, angry, alone. And I needed someone to make me feel like I wasn't alone and that I was okay and that I was still going to experience joy and I was going to be able to dance and live and survive.
Yeah.
And Cocktails recognizes the tragedy that is HIV/AIDS, but also recognizes the joy that will enable you to survive it.
Yeah.
And so this poem is called Coda and Discography, a Song of Paradise. I'm going to read the coda, and then I'll read the discography. The discography is a list poem of different disco tracks. I have made a playlist of all of these tracks, the ones that I can find.
Just for you.
Just for you. So be sure to check that out, because there is no greater joy than reading DA Powell while listening to these songs.
Yeah.
Because it totally, if you read one of these poems that can sometimes feel a little bit serious, you put on something like Eartha Kitt's I Love Men, and it's a whole other experience.
Also, for undergrads, writing exercise, if you write a poem and then put on music that seems antithetical to what you just wrote and revise the poem,
it's a good one.
Yeah.
All right, so here's D.A. Powell's coda to Repast. To enter that queer nightclub, you step over the spot, sex worker stabbed. Reminds me of the chalk outlines on Castro Street or Keith Haring's canvases. Missing, beaten, died at the end of a prolonged illness, a short fight. Phantoms of the handsome, taut, gallant, bright, slender, youthful. Go on. The garment that tore, mended. The body that failed, reclaimed. Voyeurs, passion flowers, trolls, twinks, dancers, cruisers, lovers without lovers. Here is the door marked Heaven. Someone on the dance floor, waiting just for you. Right? The disco is heaven. The disco is heaven. And you know what? It might be the most wonderful paradise on earth, but it's also home of some really terrifying deaths. Yeah. But it also might be the site of really terrifying death and violence, but it's also paradise right here on earth. It's camp.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
Quick note, disco, you think disco, you think the 70s, but after that explosion at Kaminsky Park, disco went underground. Disco didn't have the money to be the mainstream genre that it was, but people still loved dancing. So in a city like this happened in Chicago and Detroit, people still wanted to dance. So DJs took samples that had that same disco sound, that 4-on-the-floor bass drum, those groovy melodies, and they built them into what's now called house and techno. And house and techno is so embedded in the DNA of today's pop music that the pop music of people like Carly Rae Jepsen and Charlie XCX is disco to the core.
Yeah.
And so there is a queerness and a campiness that is sort of very deep within what you hear on the radio every day.
Which enacts like Powell's poetics, right? Of like using the music to sort of resurface and bring back up and continue the living.
Yeah.
It's a giant, like, you cannot erase us.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely.
Because to be clear, we're not celebrating death and violence at all.
No.
And in fact, it's hard to do this episode without starting to go into the deep, dark place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of like everyone who's been from the death and violence that's been inflicted on queer communities.
Absolutely.
Right. And then spaces where it's not straight whiteness, to be really blunt about it. Right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's a sort of like, well, that happened and you can't, it's like, despite that happening and through that happening, there's an additional layer of joy and pleasure that can happen, and knowing that you can still do it.
Yeah.
That they can't be taken away. You can't take away dance. Like, come on, just try. I was raised Pentecostal. I dance. Like, give it your best shot. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know?
So let's go ahead and close with this list poem with the discography.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, it's just a playlist, but this is a transformative playlist. So many men, so little time. Mikkel Brown. Calling all boys by the flirts. Patrick Cowley's Menergy. Only the strong survive. Precious Wilson. Or I Will Survive. Gloria Gaynor. The Flirt's Passion and Ronnie Griffith's Desire. The Boys Come to Town. Erlene Bentley. Gloria Gaynor's I Am What I Am. Eartha Kitt's I Love Men. Runaway. Taps. Seclusion. Sean Benson. Helpless, Jackie Moore, Area Faction, Saving Myself, and the 3 Degrees Set Me Free. Goodbye Bad Times, Oki and Moroder. Keep On, Holdin' On, Margaret Reynolds. Oh, Romeo's These Memories, and The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, Bonnie Bianco. Real Life's Send Me an Angel, Earth Can Be Just Like Heaven, 2 Tons of Fun, Yaz, Situation, and Don't Go, and Why by Bronski Beat. Give Me Just a Little More Time, Angela Clemens. Unexpected Lovers by Lime, and Mercy by Carol Gianni. Let's Hang On, Salazar. And Maybe This Time, Norma Lewis. Vivian V's Give Me a Break, and Her Haunting Blue Disease. Ashford and Simpson's Found a Cure. Doctor's Orders, Carol Douglas. Sylvester, singing Body Strong. Sylvester, singing Stars.
That was great. Yeah. We don't have to do it, but I encourage you to take a look at the discography and think about the poetics of placement, right? Like, and what I mean by that is where the song titles are placed in relation to the names of who created the songs and in what order, and the stanza breaks. Like, there's another exercise in there.
Yeah.
Calling all flirt. All right.
Yeah, it's like it's the most exquisite list poem. Reverence cuffed in glee. Absolutely. So we have one day left in Chicago. We've spent the morning in bed drinking our tea and talking with you, but I think it's time for us to go cuff our reverence and glee.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. All right, thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
That was phenomenal and really exciting. Everyone else, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you're listening, just know the audio quality is going to be poor because we're doing this from an iPad in a very strange building in the middle of downtown Chicago. Same for visual quality. But nevertheless, please subscribe, like, and comment, because if we get up to 1,000 subscribers, we can have our own URL. Sidebar. I know, that's like the gold standard, right? But beyond that, it's really awesome when we get comments. We made some connections at this conference, and they've already left comments on some of the videos, and we're like, cool. We understand now, like, what you like, what you want to hear more about, what works for you, what doesn't. Mm-hmm. So please interact with us. If you're listening on podcast, remember to subscribe. Your interaction would be to leave a rating in iTunes or in Spotify for which episodes you really like. All right, everything else is already linked in the bottom here on YouTube. If you're listening on the podcast, thepoetryblog.com. Catch up on all of our different platforms. Patrick's now also on Instagram, so check us out there. Just type in the poetry blog. There's no other one. You'll be fine. You'll find it. Okay, are we good?
All right, we're good.
All right, bye.